Hello, I'm Ellen Moran and I'm so pleased to welcome you today to Protest Library. This project started as part of Collections in Verse, which is a project delivered in partnership between Poet in the City, the British Library and Newcastle Libraries. And it's a partnership project that aims to bring the British Library exhibitions into other libraries across the UK in unique and creative ways focused on poetry. The exhibition that we looked at for this project was Unfinished Business, the Fight for Women's Rights. And that is an exhibition that looks at the history and ongoing struggle for women's rights, predominantly in the UK. And I was lucky enough to view items, objects from the exhibition back in 2019. And I got a sense that I really wanted to look at the theme of protest, breaking the rules, and why do we do that? Because there were so many incredible examples in this exhibition of women taking massive risks, jeopardizing their safety, their livelihood, their very lives to fight for something better. And so I really wanted to look at that. And both myself and Poet in the City believe that artwork and poetry in particular is its most powerful when it comes from communities and from unique and real places in our world. And so that's why the research period for this project began with a community group. And I was happy to work with Tyneside Women's Health in Byker. And you can see some information about what they do. Their vision is to see a world where mental health stigma is ended. And I think that they do that so incredibly well. I'm going to take you on a journey through a library of protest objects, which were kindly donated to us from various individuals. You'll see a number of posters from the women's liberation movement, like this protest banner. This was made by the Sea Red Women's Workshop, who were a collective operating in the 1970s and beyond. And these amazing posters were donated to us by Penny Renfrey, who has an incredible collection. And there's also other objects in here as well, textual objects that I believe really show the depth of feeling that people have about protest and wanting to change the world. So please come with me. Let's have a journey through protest, through objects and poetry. Starting the process of writing these poems, I worked with Tyneside Women's Health to think about what rules women are asked to obey, and then what demands we would make of society in order to change those things. And you can actually see the demands and the rules that we wrote over there. We also had a workshop where we made our own protest posters. We looked at some of the posters that Penny lent us to have a look at and made our own using collage. And there's some really interesting outcomes there. And they kind of explore their feelings about breaking the rules and about servitude, I would say, in some cases. And we also had frank discussions about what's expected of us in the home. We talked a lot about the domestic world. And this is reflected in these two posters here that are from Wages for Housework and Domestic Labour campaigns, in which women demanded monetary reparations for the work that they did in the home. And in addition to these conversations, what struck me was the simplicity of things that came up in the discussions. So it showed me that protest sometimes is an attitude rather than an event. It starts with a strong decision to defy the simplest of things. And I made a list of all of the things that those women told me, and I put them into a poem that rhymes. You hear it again. And it's called Enough. Sometimes it's enough just to break a man's silence, to exist listening in his world for so long that just whispering is your defiance. Sometimes it's enough to say no, to say excuse me to an unwanted intrusion, refuse a hug or ask someone to go. Sometimes it's enough not to go to confession. Stop speaking your sins and start asking your own questions. Sometimes it's enough to join the congregation, to worship and be faithful, to be grateful, patient and graceful. Sometimes it's enough to ask for what you're owed, stop carrying someone else's load, shed your burdens and stay composed. Sometimes it's enough to pipe up, to interrupt, to defy expectations and be abrupt. Sometimes it's enough to demand to be heard, to command, to assert, to speak regardless of hurt. Sometimes it's enough to discuss splitting up, stop committing, back off, plaster yourself up. Sometimes it's enough not to smile or give your number, to cross the street, to repeat, I don't have a boyfriend, I'm just not interested in every single man I meet. Sometimes it's enough just to mention the cleaning, stop feeding and sweeping, start believing it's okay to leave your dishes after eating. Sometimes it's enough to fall in love, to circumvent arrangements others made for you and be your own judge. Sometimes it's enough to ask for respect, stop trying to impress, make requests, be denied and get depressed. Sometimes it's enough to back up a mate, sometimes it's enough to stay out late, sometimes it's enough to walk away. There's all these tiny rules women are breaking every day, all these lasses sitting telling each other, actually that's okay, but all this male aggression mounting up and getting in the way, and all these women getting worried and hiding themselves away. It can feel like it's never enough. It can start to test your patience. It can get relentless. It can end up in frustration. So when you lie in bed and you think of all the things you did and said, know that one day it will be enough for our liberation. So come along to the next point. So when we think about protest, we quite often think about the past. It's like an automatic response is to go back to the things that have happened before. We think about civil rights movements, movements for social change and equality, and even revolutions. And that's because without those things, we simply wouldn't have the freedoms that we have today. And the effects of protest are deeply ingrained in our daily lives, even if we don't realize it. And protests can be done in a lot of different ways. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Some people form small groups and look at one single issue that means something to them and aim to fight that change. And some people take a broader view, hoping to change a great deal about society with their action. And nowadays that's known as intersectionality, but it's actually really old. And it's impossible to ignore the suffragettes when we think about protest, women's protest in particular. And my intersectional feminist hero is Sylvia Pankhurst, a suffragette who never gave up agitating, educating, and organising. They're the three things we need if we're going to change anything. And I was inspired to write this poem after talking to the women at Tyneside Women's Health about their relationship with the suffragettes and how they feel about the suffragettes and how idolized that movement around, because it had just come out of the centenary, so people were really talking about that at the time. But also I saw this photograph of Sylvia Pankhurst standing on a big scaffolding plank, and I was inspired to write this very short poem. Sylvia on scaffolding speaks to me from her parapet of the people, of strength in numbers, a backbone of power where all hope would look lost. Sylvia on scaffolding speaks to me from her lectern of agitation, of the abuse that comes from capital, a platform to protest where workers are ground down. Sylvia on scaffolding speaks to me from her wooden crafted frame, of the many hands of women, a multitude of digits ready to rebuild the world. So, Sylvia didn't always have a good time. She sacrificed herself for us again and again. She was force-fed, imprisoned and abused. As she watched poor women, women of colour, Jewish women and Irish women be subjected to even worse than her as a privileged white English woman, she continued to fight for their rights. Unlike her sister Chrisabel and her mother Emmeline, who disowned her for supporting Irish women in particular, she wanted equality for all. And in prison, she wrote her own poetry on thick, scratchy toilet paper. In this poetry, she imagined herself as a bird. She longed for freedom for everyone. And this is the problem with protest. It grinds you down and sometimes it locks you up. There's always a consequence to protest, whether it's as severe as the abuse that Sylvia suffered or the general overhanging disillusionment that comes with losing, seeing your rights eroded, seeing vulnerable people get squashed, new policies that any right-minded person, new bills that anyone could see would make things worse for the vast majority of people. And sometimes we see ourselves get entrapped in structures which further imprison us. So, for example, abuse within leftist organisations and the voting system. So that could be look at voting for someone who doesn't get in, as simple as that, or someone getting in who you didn't vote for, or someone who you did vote for gets in but don't do any of the things that they said that they would. And there's infighting between feminists, black women ignored, trans women denied their rights, denied their very existence, and denied the opportunity to speak. Disabled people having to speak louder and louder and louder to facilitate their own spaces, and LGBTQIA plus people pushed aside, marginalised, all of this and more. So, here is my own toilet paper poetry. And it speaks to that feeling, and it's called Disillusionment. Unions be buried by empty cardboard boxes, where once were scrawled slogans and banners, tapestries woven, now trampling defeat and trained feet march solemnly to the marketeer's drum. Swindled down through dirty districts, kicking litter, on our way to shiny towns in painted shipping containers, to pay our last scraps to bigger businesses where our copper is melted down into their gold. Watch us be blown home, out of town like rubbish in the street, towards broken concrete floors and smashed glass doors to crumble like a leaf in winter. I bet they'll barely pay us to clean up the mess. Volunteer bin men will sweep up their brothers and sisters and pets, all those who starved to death. Unremarkable, but one day all that was left. If protest is so painful, why do we do it? It doesn't just disillusion us. It doesn't just feel like a struggle, and it doesn't always feel like a fight. People wouldn't do it if it felt like a fight, and I'm a firm believer of that, although maybe there's some people who get a little bit addicted to the struggle. It actually, though, empowers us. And every win is sweet and special when it's taken so much time and effort to make the change. And working together and making decisions as to what will be the most effective means of protest actually empowers us and feeds our drive to make and remake our world. And there's some incredible posters here for you to take a look at, and please read the caption and information about the history and context of these posters. But I think that these are some brilliant examples of the hope and togetherness that people experience in protest. And this next poem is the sister poem to Disillusionment, and it's called Empowerment, and you can see it there. Light shines through stained glass, projects red and greens onto vast rooms filled with limbs and faces, painted walls of historical figures, and nature capture moments, portraits of people who won things, assemblies of bodies, confront sameness and difference, repurpose plastic, grow hemp, come up with funny slogans for placards, acronyms to cover flags, mend floorboards, resist corruption, tie up children's laces, organise resistance, hand out biscuits, elect delegates and leaders, refill mugs with tea. People sing, copy tones, some guess at fifths and thirds, chain and unchain relentlessly, giving themselves authority to amalgamate. Some erect masts, lick fingers to feel for wind direction, and set sail to bigger public places. We pay ourselves forward as epigenetic tribute, photosynthesizing together in hot summer sun, dividing equally to become daughter cells of each other. We embrace the chaos, the shape of life. So this is the last point on our journey, and this is some of my favourite things that were donated to Protest Library. These items of clothing and jewellery have been worn on protests and lent to us by Kurdish women living in the UK. Textures and fabrics are incredibly important in Kurdish culture. Threads of green and red and yellow are purposefully woven together in symbolism of the Kurdish flag, which itself is a textural representation of what the Kurdish people stand for. So red symbolises the blood of martyrs of freedom. And remember, we're talking about people who have fought and fought again in so many wars to have their land and their country just acknowledged, and it still isn't. Green is a symbol of life and vitality, nature and landscapes. And yellow is the symbol of the sun and enlightenment, and it has a long religious and cultural history behind it. And so the story of women's protest is woven together physically and metaphorically. Protest comes from a deep, creative place. A place where we urge to bring new things into the world. We birth them. It's about making things. It's about us wanting to make and remake society. And this is something that women are very good at, because we make and remake ourselves every day. We repair each other, talking, loving, skillfully building bridges to help each other get better, to help the whole world get better, even when men tell us to stop. And this is what I found at Tyneside Women's Health. There is a tenderness to protest, a delicateness that you can feel if you let it wrap around you. I truly believe that if we approach protest in a compassionate way, we are more likely to affect change. If we focus on building, repairing, and coming together, rather than tearing things down and dividing ourselves into warring factions, if we face our protests with clear demands and honest, compassionate will, then the world has to become a better place. And this suffragette is a representation of that. The women at Tyneside Women's Health tenderly crafted her from scraps of fabric, just as we piece together our own tender protests every day. Making, remaking, changing, repairing things, this is what we do. And the suffragettes gave us so much, and yet it was desperately violent at times. But they never gave up because they needed to see a better world. And this is a tender and delicate response to women who sacrificed themselves for us. And it made me sit back and think about the women who made me, and it inspired my final poem. Ellen Wilkinson must have had fabric hands. Thread, fingertips, pin-cushion palms and wrists releasing silk banners scrawled with demands. With each word, she wove workmen's minds, embroidered closed-down shipyards, blanketed the workhouse without walls, wrapped malnourished in patchworked cotton. Women and war kept the yards open. Shipbuilders' uniforms split. Frayed edges of thick melting wool screeched when caught on scraps of steel. So it was lucky that my grandma too had fabric hands, felted tough fabrics to withstand North Sea spray, repaired donkey jackets with nimble loops, used pianists' fingers to knit hats and scarves, peeled patterns from magazines to adorn children in 1960s lace trims. When I fell and broke my skin, my mother buttoned it back up. Her hand cream softness silked over exposed tissue, caressed my baby cheeks as I reached for the cared-for cuticles on her fabric hands. She unthimbled me, showed me the supple potential of loose strands. Fingers like cords, clutching spoons and pens, fluttered at home and at work, decorating and designing templates to help my hands become more elastic. She handed me a thread that I followed down to the river. I found women there holding each other up with their fabric hands, mending broken bones and brains with pinpoint accuracy, meshing together stories and problems by fusing scraps of linen into bigger and bigger pieces, binding with zigzag lines their love and anger, knotting chunks of nylon fear and mohair hope to entwine tightly a net of women's work. I'll plait myself inside it, anchor myself in with a piece of string, let my ribboned hair merge with the wind, and when I walk, I'll be pulled by crocheted waves made by women before me. I'll fold into them because I wear a dress made of fabric hands.